Hi class, this is Sir Alex Vasco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. Today we are going to talk about 6.2 of our lesson 6, and this time we are going to do an introduction to photosynthesis. This is part 1. We are just going to talk about photosynthesis in general, and in part 2 we are going to talk about photosynthesis in depth as we talk about the two-step processes that is happening on photosynthesis, namely light dependent reaction and light independent reaction. So for now, let's go ahead and discuss the introduction to photosynthesis. So what is photosynthesis? Basically, photosynthesis is a process that photosynthetic materials such as plants and other organisms such as cyanobacteria or algae uses light energy and convert it into chemical energy in form of sugars. Um, these sugars are created from the water and the carbohydrates that the plant uptake. So the water comes from the soil, which is uptake by root into the stem and into the leaves, where a lot of photosynthesis is happening, while carbohydrates or carbon dioxide is a gas that diffuses into the inside of the leaf via the pores that is found on the surface of the leaf called stomata. So the organelles inside the cell which we will be going to talk about later uses this H2O or water and carbon dioxide and transform these into sugar. And inevitably, one of the product of photosynthesis is oxygen, which is an intended product. It's not used by the plant, but it's something that is very important because it's something that we use instead. So it's not the main product of photosynthesis, but it's just a side product. You can think of it that way. That's why we call it a byproduct. So this is just a small pictures of what photosynthesis is. So you have light, and that light is being captured on the cells of the leaves, and in which we use that light and convert the carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, or which we will be commonly calling them as sugars. So why is this necessary for the plant to do? What is the use of this sugar? Well, sugar provides two important resources. Number one, energy. Because if you guys remember our discussion on cellular respiration, we actually use sugar, or in this situation, glucose, in order for us to create ADPs or ATPs. If you guys remember cellular respiration, where our cells intake glucose via the sym port, where it goes inside with the sodium, and from there we have our different cycles where we can convert glucose into pyruvate and pyruvate in acetyl CoA, and then we have the four steps of the cellular respiration until we create as such FADH and ADH, and then ultimately we create ATPs. So glucose can serve as a fuel for the cell. And during the cellular respiration, we create ATPs. So carbohydrates or sugars are very important. Another resource that carbohydrates or sugars create or provide is called the fixed carbon. Carbon fixation is a process wherein we turn inorganic carbon to organic carbon. So inorganic carbon, such as carbon found in CO2, when we turn these carbons into an organic carbon, and this organic carbon are called fixed carbon. Example of a carbon in an organic carbon is the carbons found in your sugars or carbohydrates or glucose. So these are important because they can be created to actually build other organic molecules that the cell needs. So these are the two important things that carbohydrates provide, while why the plants create these sugars via photosynthesis. Another thing of the importance of photosynthesis is what we call the photoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs is basically photosynthetic organisms that utilizes light to create organic molecules such as carbohydrates. Photoautotrophs are, for example, plants. So they can utilize the sunlight to create something, or in this situation, organic molecules. So why are these important? Because we have those what we call heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are organisms that can't produce their own food. So instead, in order for them to get the nutrients they need, they oftentimes have to eat photoautotrophs, which, for examples, we have like a moose here eating our flower here, or in such situations wherein we eat our vegetables. Now, humans are heterotrophs. We cannot produce our own food. We are not chemically doing something inside our body in order for us to create the nutrients and food necessary for our survival. We have to get the food that we need from other animals and other vegetables in order for us to get the necessary materials in order for us to survive. So that's one thing that is important in photosynthesis. Photoautotrophs or autotrophs create those fixed carbons, create those sugars that when heterotrophs eat, now they have a source of glucose, they have a source of sugar, and they have source of fixed carbon. Another importance of photosynthesis is the influence in Earth atmosphere. If you remember our discussion in the beginning of the Earth, when the Earth started, the atmospheric composition of the Earth is very different to what we have now. What attributed to this change is the evolution of various photosynthetic organisms such as the cyanobacteria. When the cyanobacteria about 330 billion years ago, I hope you guys remember the propagation of the cyanobacteria, photosynthesis starts to happen, and photosynthetic organisms most of the time produces oxygen or O2 as their byproduct. So when we have massive algae during the propagation of the cyanobacteria about 330 billion years ago, what happened is that massive creation of oxygen starts to appear in the atmosphere, and slowly the atmosphere changed wherein we have about 16% oxygen now in our atmosphere. So, but interesting, some fact that I find interesting, and I hope you guys find interesting, a lot of the oxygen that we breathe actually does not come from the trees around us. You may think that the oxygen that we breathe nowadays, trees are the necessary culprit, or are the organisms that produce the most oxygen. That is actually not true. Most of the oxygen that we breathe today are actually created by the phytoplanktons in the ocean. Phytoplanktons are basically different types of plankton that can process or that can undergo photosynthesis to create their own food, and there's actually tons of them in the surface of the ocean. And as they float in the surface of the ocean, they utilizes that sunlight to create or to photosynthesize to create tons of oxygen in the air, and that's the oxygen that we actually breathe. So a lot of them comes from the oceanic phytoplankton. Another important thing of the creation of oxygen is that it also reduces the quantities of carbon dioxide. So as you can see here, we take carbon dioxide, and those photosynthetic organisms utilizes that carbon dioxide to create carbons, and then they releases oxygen. So one important thing that trees does is to actually reduce our carbon emission. As humans progress and as humans succeed and our technology become more advanced, it's quite inevitable for us to use more energy. And for now, a lot of the energy that we use are not renewable, or in layman's term, they're quite dangerous to the earth. So what happened is that we have this massive accumulation of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and what happens is there's what we call the climate change, and we can actually experience that now. If you notice that every year, the Christmas season in the Philippines may be getting hotter and hotter, that's part of climate change. So how are the photosynthetic organisms such as these or even trees helps us combat climate change? Well, because they uses carbon dioxide. For example, in US alone, about for 1.4 1.4 million tons of carbon dioxide or equivalent are removed because of trees. So one way for us to combat this changing climates is by planting trees, so that they can utilize that massive carbon dioxide emission that is happening from a lot of our power plants. So that is the importance of photosynthesis. We can change the atmospheric condition via tons of trees or via these massive populations of photosynthetic organisms such as algae. Another thing is for us to get our food, especially for heterotrophs, and of course for the photoautotrophs to also get their food. So those are the ecological importance of photosynthesis. But let's go on and talk a little bit more about photosynthesis. Where does photosynthesis happen? Well, photosynthesis happen in anything that is green in the plants. So if you see a plant and you see something that is a green or has a color green in the plants, it means photosynthesis is happening there. But most of the time for these plants, photosynthesis is happening on the leaves. And that's why a lot of the leaves that you see are green. So you will find just underneath the surface of the leaf is what we call a mesophyll cell layer. Mesophyll is basically found in the inner tissue of a leaf, and it contains many chloroplasts. Chloroplast, so this is your leaf. You will find your mesophyll cell layer, and in that mesophyll you will find tons of chloroplasts. So this is just a single mesophyll cell, and if you look at there, you will find tons and tons and tons of chloroplast. And inside the chloroplast, for that, something that is important to note is called the stomata. Stomata, if you can see right there, stomata are basically pores that you find in the surface of on the surface of your leaf, and this surface is important because this is the site where carbon dioxide diffuses into mesophyll, or it enters from the surrounding environment inside the leaves. So, and also stomata is the area wherein carbon dioxide diffuses out of the leaf. So this is the oxygen that we breathe. Next, inside the chloroplast, you will find the organelles called the thylakoids. So chloroplasts, you will find them in mesophyll, and chloroplasts are important cells because they are cells that are photosynthetic. These are the specialized cells. If you guys remember the specialization, or when the cell change from being very general to something that has a specialized function, so they differentiate. So some of the cells become chloroplasts, wherein they differentiate themselves in order to be especially used for photosynthesis. Found in this chloroplast are called the thylakoids. Thylakoids are the disc structure. So that one disc that you see is called a thylakoids. And so that one disc right there is called a thylakoid. And if you stack them together in such a way that you form like a stack of pancake, or you can think of this as a coin, or you can think of this as also as the Michelin Man. So this one right here is the thylakoid. Okay, thylakoid. And if you combine all this thylakoid together, this is called a grana. Grana is basically a combination of those, or multiple of these. One compilation of thylakoids is called a grana, singular. So why are these necessary? Because in thylakoids you will actually find your chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the green pigment, or it absorbs light or the energy coming from the sunlight. So these chlorophyll pigments, you will find them on the surface of your thylakoids, and they're the one necessary in absorbing the light. And everywhere else, so you have your thylakoids, your granum there, you will find them surrounding in a membrane. It's actually a double membrane. So you have your outer membrane and inner membrane, and inside that membrane it's basically a fluid like structure, and this fluid filled structure is called a stroma. and you will also find this fluid inside the thylakoid. So in the thylakoid inside is there's a space inside. So another thing about thylakoid, you may think thylakoid is just like a pancake, so a stacking of pancake. But if you cut that open, it's actually something like this. So it looks like a maze inside. So it's not, so if you cut it open, you will not find something like this. So that's a flat surface, but it inside it's more like a maze. Wherein it's, I'm not really good at drawing, but it's basically something like this. So it's not separate, it's just one continuous maze of a structure. That's what thylakoids are. And again, I don't think that's necessary. But yeah, so the thylakoids, on the surface of the thylakoids, that's where you will find your chlorophyll, which are your green pigments, which is the one necessary absorbing the light energy. Okay, so this is where the site, this is where photosynthesis happens. So in these thylakoids, in this stroma, and on the chlorophylls of your thylakoid, and everything found in the chloroplast, and the chloroplast are found in the mesophyll cells. So there are actually, photosynthesis is actually a very confusing and very complicated step. But for the intents and purposes of this class, we are going to basically generalize it into two steps. Number one is the light-dependent reactions, and number two is the Calvin cycle. Light-dependent reactions, from the name itself, light-dependent, it needs light. This is all happening on the membrane of the thylakoid. Remember, thylakoid, on the membrane, you will find your chlorophyll. And on that chlorophyll, when continuous, it needs a continuous source or supply of sunlight. So when sunlight hits the thylakoid membrane, the chlorophyll absorbs that light. So when the chlorophyll absorbs the light, it converts that light into chemical energy, forming ATPs and NADH. So that is the first part of photosynthesis, or the light-dependent reactions. Again, they happen in the thylakoid and the membrane of the thylakoid, where you will find your chlorophyll, which absorbs the light and converts that light energy in forms of ATP and NADH. So something right here, you have your H2O, and the H2O, you plus basically the light, your oxygen is released, and that's what we breathe, and then ATP and NADH are created, and then they move on to the second part of the photosynthesis, which is called the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle is also called as light independent reaction. This is a reaction that does not necessarily require light. It's indirectly requiring light, because the light is utilized by the first reaction, and then the Calvin cycle happens. So this Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. Remember, the stroma is the space-filled fuel that you will find in your chloroplast, and you will also find them inside your thylakoid. So happening in this stroma is that it takes the ATP and NADH created by the light-dependent reactions, and then using a redox reaction, what it does is it creates the sugar. So it utilizes the carbon dioxide, and via carbon fixation, it uses the carbon from carbon dioxide to finally create or G3P. G3P is a 3-carbon sugar called the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and these glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate combine together to form glucose. So that's what the whole step of photosynthesis is. In our next part, we are going to talk in depth about these processes, light dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle, how it happens, the detail. Okay, so that is the step of photosynthesis. And lastly, let's talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration, if you think about it, they're actually very opposite. It's an opposite reaction of what is happening on each other. But even though they're very opposite, there are some similarities between them. One such similarities is the involvement of redox reaction. Redox reaction is where we have electron transfer. As for photosynthesis, what happens is during the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle, we take carbon dioxide and we take water and we create glucose and oxygen. We take the water during the light-dependent reaction and we take carbon dioxide during the Calvin cycle. And during the light-dependent reaction, we create the oxygen, and the glucose is created during the Calvin cycle. So this is the whole process of photosynthesis. And during the light dependent reactions, we also create what we call the NADH and ATPs, right? And this NADH and ATP is being utilized by the Calvin cycle to create carbon dioxide into glucose. But for cellular respiration, it's happening on the opposite side. What happens is that we take glucose, which our cells intake, and the oxygen that we breathe, and then using various process of cellular respiration that we already talked about, we take this glucose and oxygen and we create water and carbon dioxide. And what happens is that instead of utilizing the ADP and the NADH, this is basically the product that we want. We create ATPs, or the energy that we need in order for us to function. And all of this happens in a via redox reaction. If you guys remember redox reaction, the oxidative phosphorylation, wherein you have your NADH and your FADH in your cellular respiration, donate their electron, their H plus, and then you create the H gradient, wherein it goes to ATP synthase, and that gradient goes through the ATP synthase to create ATPs. So when the NADH and the FADH pass on to, so if you guys remember, you have your basically 3 cells, and then they keep passing this H plus, this electron, and what happens is it keeps pumping electrons or protons outside the mitochondria. I'm not sure if you guys remember, but that's what's happening on the cellular respiration. And the same thing is actually happening for photosynthesis. So even though they're in the opposite direction, redox reaction is happening for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That is the similarities between the two and the differences as well. So this is just the photosynthesis introduction. The next part, we are going to talk about in depth about the Calvin cycle and the light dependent reaction. If you guys have any question about this, please message me, and thank you so much. Have a great day. Mahalo.